So in the most recent developer livestream for Season 2 of Diablo 4, we finally got a look at all of the new unique items coming in Season 2. So in this video, I want to go over all those different uniques and also go over some additional information because of how much stuff is actually changing with Season 2. And keep in mind, these are just the brand new uniques coming with this season. Basically, every other unique in Diablo 4 also got changed in some way, whether that be changing out an affix, increasing the affix rolls on the items, or potentially fully changing up the special effect of that unique item. So a lot of the existing uniques may also fill different roles or enable different builds once Season 2 is released. And we're going to be getting 12 new uniques for Season 2. We're getting 7 general uniques that every class can use, and then 1 class specific unique for all of the different classes. So first off, we have Tassets of the Dawning Sky, which are generic unique pants. When you take damage from a non-physical damage type, you gain 6 to 10% maximum resistance to that damage type for 6 seconds. This effect can only apply to one damage type at a time. Now I think I need to go over the resistance rework for this to make sense. The first part of the resistance rework is that resistances are now just additive. So if you have 20% poison resistance, you get a piece of gear with another 20%, you now have 40%. And that's just how it works. Very simple, a much better way for the resistance system to work. So if you have 40%, you gain another item with another 20%, you're at 60. And it continues in that linear fashion, so it's very easy to understand. Now with this change also comes a cap to all resistances. So all resistances cap at 70%. Going above that doesn't give you any additional benefit. But there are some effects in the game, like the one on these unique pants, that can increase your maximum resistance. So if say you had 70% poison resistance and you put on these pants and you go face a boss that does all poison damage. You get hit with some poison damage, and let's say you have a best rolled version of these pants. Now you have 80% poison resistance because you got hit by poison damage for these uniques. So it increases the maximum, and any maximum resistance effect is going to be much more valuable and powerful than any other normal resistance effect. So these pants in certain situations are actually going to be incredibly strong, and more specifically, these are going to be incredibly strong for the new 5 endgame bosses we're getting in Season 2, because all these bosses are focused around a specific element. So if you're facing a boss that primarily does a specific elemental damage, these pants are always going to give you an increase to that maximum resistance, which will massively reduce the damage you're going to be taking from all of this boss's attacks. And next up, we have Godslayer Crown, a generic unique helmet. When you stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite enemy or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies, and then you deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds. This effect can only occur once every 12 seconds, and this damage increase is multiplicative, so it's a pretty massive damage increase. And I think depending on what class you play is actually going to determine if this helmet is good, because say you're playing something like a druid, you're never going to be able to use this. The vast majority of endgame druid builds are using some type of unique helmet, but other classes that may not use unique helmets, this could be pretty strong. Most classes will have some way of applying one of these effects, and this is just pretty good on bosses, because if you just damage a boss, you get this pretty big multiplicative damage increase for 3 seconds once every 12 seconds. So that will overall be a pretty big damage increase against bosses. And then if you have that CC, the pulling all enemies together is going to be incredibly strong. One of the first things I think of is any sorcerer build that doesn't use the uniques that already pull everything together, because basically every sorcerer can freeze, so this could be pretty good for most of their builds. And then next up, we have what's seeming to be a ridiculously strong pair of unique boots, which are called Flicker Step, which are generic unique boots. Each enemy you evade through reduces your ultimate cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds up to 10 seconds. So basically what that means is when you evade through one enemy, your ultimate cooldown is reduced by 2 to 4 seconds. That's the roll range on the item. But then if you evade through a full pack of enemies, it'll reduce your ultimate cooldown up to 10 seconds. So if you evade through infinite enemies, it's still only a 10-second cooldown. But that's per evade. Evade doesn't have a super long cooldown, and this is reducing your ultimate cooldown. So any class that uses a very strong ultimate, especially a fire and forget ultimate, not one that you're going to pop an ultimate and be in it a long time, this is going to be ridiculous. And I think something that makes this even stronger is that these are unique boots. A lot of classes and a lot of builds don't actually use unique boots, especially when looking at something, say a druid. I don't recall basically any top druid build using any unique boots. So that makes these even stronger because they're not taking up a slot of another unique item you'll need. So I think these boots are definitely going to be heavily used for pretty much every class. And next up we have Tibalt's Will, which are generic unique pants. You deal 20 to 40% multiplicative increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. When you become unstoppable, gain 50 of your primary resource. Now this is decently strong at a base because basically every endgame build needs some form of unstoppable. I don't know of many endgame builds that don't at least have one form of unstoppable. Even if it's just one longer cooldown that gives you unstoppable, this could still be pretty decent, up to 40% multiplicative damage increase for the entirety of the unstoppable and 4 seconds after. So even if it's a small unstoppable, it's still a big damage increase, and you're gaining 50 primary resource every time you become unstoppable, which is very good. But also the second part of this, that when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 primary resource, also means that any build that constantly reapplies unstoppable is going to be very strong. And again, as being a druid main, I think of any druid build that is fully built around resets and around that capstone that resets all of your abilities. You can use something like Earthen Bulwark, constantly be resetting that, and that'll be constantly proccing unstoppable with you. And specifically in builds like Tramp Slide, where you're both resetting Earthen Bulwark and you're resetting Trample that both give unstoppable, every time you use one of those, you're going to be getting 50 of your primary resource. So if you can create a build that constantly procs unstoppable, that uses a lot of your primary resource, this second effect could be strong enough to not even care about the first effect and it would still be worthwhile, but then you're also getting a massive multiplicative damage increase. So I think in specific builds, these are going to be pretty ridiculous. And then next up, we have Zafau's Corroded Signet, a generic unique ring that's a lucky hit. Your damage over time effects have up to a 50% chance to erupt, dealing 5 to 6 damage of the same type to nearby enemies. Now these damage numbers aren't specific, but I think this is saying it's going to deal 5 to 6 times the damage that was procced off of that damage over time. And that may sound ridiculous, but I think it makes sense, as this lucky hit would be proccing off of a dot damage proc. So it would just be that one instance of the dot. If you put a 12-second dot on a target and it's proccing every second, the total damage of that dot could be pretty big, but every single one of those procs every second would be much smaller. So it would make sense that it would be 5 to 6 times of that damage proc. And then it's also going to be in an AoE. Now, something we also don't know is if this damage proc is going to be able to apply additional effects, maybe apply damage over time from the proc from this item itself. Not sure on that, but this is also a lucky hit, which does take it down a little bit, but it is up to a 50% chance, which is on the higher side for most lucky hit effects. And I'm very curious to see what type of dot builds can actually be used, because this does allow for a lot of damage spreading and AoE damage procs from a dot build that may be better for single target or may have more issues in AoE situations. And I am also curious if this is going to deal the damage to the enemy it procs from, because it does say to nearby enemies, and I think a lot of the time that also means it's damaging the enemy it procs from. And if it damages the enemy it actually procs from, this could potentially also be a pretty big damage increase for single target fights if you can apply a bunch of damage over time effects, or if you could get damage over time effect that deal their damage very quickly. This could constantly be proccing a bunch of additional damage on a single target as well. And then next up we have Soul Brand, a unique generic chess piece. Your healing potion no longer heals instantly. Instead, it grants a barrier for 200% of the healing for 4 seconds. While you have a barrier, you gain 10 to 20% damage reduction. Now on first glance, I think a lot of people would probably think this is pretty bad, but I think specifically with Season 2, this could be incredibly strong, and depending on what class or build you're using, this could always be very strong. Now when looking at it through the lens of specifically Season 2, there is a vampire power specifically in Season 2 that anytime you cast an ability, you heal for 3% of your max life, which will give a ludicrous amount of healing to any build in the game. And I think just using that vampiric power actually makes this chess piece pretty strong, because a lot of the time you're going to end up dying is through a big burst of damage. For most builds at least, because most builds do have some type of healing, and mixed in with that massive increase to healing from the power, you don't actually need other healing. You just need to be able to survive the big bursty damage, and giving yourself a massive barrier with damage reduction while having a barrier means that you can pop this big barrier, all that bursty damage is going to be going towards a barrier, and you're just spamming abilities, constantly healing yourself up. So this could be incredibly strong, but one of the big issues I see with this is that chess pieces are usually used to roll 4 different defensive affixes. Before season 2, it was just all the damage reduction stuff, so like damage reduction to close or distant, and I think chess pieces are still probably going to be used for that for 4 big defensive affixes. So depending on what the actual rolls on this item are could determine if it's really good or if it's useless because it doesn't have those damage reduction rolls on it. And then for the final generic unique, we have Banished Lord's Talisman, which is a unique generic amulet. After you spend 300 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. And then a secondary effect is your critical strikes that overpower deal 80 to 120% increased damage, and this damage increase is multiplicative. So this is just an absurd damage increase. This amulet seems to be fully built for pulverized druids. Now the first part of this, after spending 300 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. This could actually mean a lot of different builds and classes actually have more ways to give themselves guaranteed overpower, which is something that say druids and blood necromancers already have a lot of, so that can be pretty strong depending on how much primary resource you use and generate. But just the second part of this unique makes it incredibly strong for any build that has guaranteed overpowers, because for most endgame builds you're going to have a decent bit of critical strike chance, and if you have guaranteed overpowers you're going to be able to crit on an overpower a decent amount of the time, and getting a 120% multiplicative damage increase on those will just basically insta kill the entirety of your screen. Absolutely perfect for pulverized druids, because on a pulverized druid you have I think 3 or 4 class based effects that can proc guaranteed overpowers for you. Then you have another on this amulet itself, but for pulverized druids you're also using a capstone that you're consistently proccing that fills up your primary resource and makes all of your attacks guaranteed crits for 5 seconds, and this can also reproc itself. So once you get that proc on a pulverized druid, you're going to have guaranteed crits, and you're going to have a bunch of ways to guarantee overpowers, meaning you're going to consistently be dealing like 120% increased multiplicative damage on your pulverized once you get your guaranteed crit proc, because you're just going to constantly be re-getting overpower procs on top of that, meaning you're just going to be getting some ridiculous damage increases with this item. I am actually very excited to play a druid in season 2 just to see how big of single hits you can get on a pulverized druid with this necklace. And then next up we have our class specific uniques, starting with the Barbarian with Tusk Helm of Joritz the Mighty, which is a Barbarian unique helm. When you gain berserking while already berserk, you have a 40 to 60% chance to become more enraged, granting 15% multiplicative damage increase, 2 fury per second, and 10% cooldown reduction. And right off the bat, I have to say, I find it incredibly funny that a Barbarian unique causes you to get more mad from getting mad. So if you proc a berserk on top of your berserk, you just have a chance to become more berserk on top of that, which is just one of the funniest things and the most barbarian thing I could think of. But the actual stats and effects on this item are actually really good. 15% multiplicative damage increase on a up to 60% chance is pretty good in itself. Keep in mind this isn't lucky hit, this is just actually 40 to 60% chance depending on the roll of the item. But then you're also gaining 2 fury per second and 10% cooldown reduction. All 3 of these things are like the most important things for Barbarian. Multiplicative damage increase is the most important thing for everybody. Fury per second is something very important for Barbarians, and cooldown reduction is something very important for Barbarians. So I think overall just the power of this helmet is pretty good. I think we'll probably see this used quite a bit. And then next up we have what I think is one of the most interesting unique items put into Diablo 4 up until this point, and this is for the druid, and it's the Dolmen Stone, which is a druid unique amulet. So casting boulder while your hurricane is active will cause your boulders to rotate around you. And if you don't know what these are, hurricane is just like a small storm you build up around yourself. It's an AoE on the ground around yourself that follows you around, and then after you cast boulders, which is a big rock you throw at people, it gets stuck in your hurricane on the edge of it and just spins around you the entirety of the time hurricane is active, and all the boulders you cast when it's active get stuck. So if you cast a dozen boulders, you now have this small storm circling around you, and at the edge you have a dozen boulders just circling around you, smacking everything that comes close to you. Now, the reasons I think this is one of the most unique, interesting items is because this integrates two different spells into each other that synergize specifically based off of each other and changes up the strengths of both of these skills, because this turns Hurricane into basically just an item that the only thing you care about is its cooldown and its duration, because you want it up as long as you can and you want to be able to reproc it as much as you can. And then for boulders, it changes to you wanting to basically cast as many of them as you possibly can, and then it'll also change up your movement because you have to position yourself correctly to make sure these boulders are hitting everything around you. And Boulder already has a ton of other effects and legendary effects that build up that skill, not to the point to where it was actually usable before, but with something like this could turn Boulder from being something that is just a little bit off being usable in an endgame build to potentially being ridiculously strong. And then next up, we have the Necromancer with Blood Moon Breaches, which are Necromancer Unique pants. Your minions have a 3 to 7% chance to curse enemies, and then enemies afflicted by at least one of your curses take 70% increased multiplicative overpower damage from you. So this is another one of those uniques that have two different effects on it. First, your minions have a chance to curse enemies, and then anything cursed by one of your curses, you deal this massively increased overpower damage to them. So you could even use this in a build with no minions. You could just use one curse and a build that focuses on overpower, and you would have a massive multiplicative damage increase to overpower. But if you're using both, this is going to be better. And keep in mind, this isn't a lucky hit, so it's just up to a 7% chance for all of your minions to curse enemies, which if you say have a dozen minions, they're all hitting targets with a 7% chance to curse. That's quite a lot of free curses going out. And because of all the changes coming with Season 2, which massively buff overpower, I think Blood Necromancers are going to be very strong in Season 2, and I think this is going to be very good for them. The first thing I thought of is a build I actually theory crafted before Diablo 4 was even out, which was a Necromancer focusing on minions, but having Blood Surge, which is a blood skill that you can have guaranteed overpower procs on, with also one of the Necromancer Unique items that when you Blood Surge, all of your minions Blood Surge, which depending on how the curse proc on this actually works, this could potentially mean that you Blood Surge, all of your minions Blood Surge, which is a big AoE. One of your minions gets this curse proc from the Blood Surge, which is a big AoE, meaning it curses everything, and you could potentially not even need to use a curse because your minions will just do it because they're doing so much AoE damage from this build, and then you're just getting that massive overpower damage increase from your Blood Surge, which has guaranteed overpowers. So I think there's going to be some builds that definitely want to use this for Necromancers. And then next up, we have the Rogue with a Scoundrel's Leathers, which are a Rogue unique chess piece. When you have unlimited energy from Inner Sight, your core skills have a 60 to 80% chance to spawn Caltrops, Poison Trap, or Death Trap. And Inner Sight is one of the Rogue's specializations, so they're a unique class mechanic, and they basically build it up to get unlimited energy for a certain amount of time. And with this, when that procs, your core skill, which is going to be one of the main things you're spamming, can have up to just an 80% chance, not a lucky hit, just a literal up to 80% chance to spawn one of these traps. And keep in mind, Death Trap is an ultimate skill, so depending on how often you can get Inner Sight and how quickly you can spam out core skills in that, you could potentially get a ludicrous amount of traps to drop. And getting just a bunch of Death Traps to proc is pretty ridiculous considering it's an ultimate, so you could think of this as having the possibility of just spawning a handful of ultimates in a couple seconds time. So I do think this is something that's at minimum going to be played around with a lot, and I think it's probably going to be ridiculously strong. This also seems like one of those uniques that's going to just have some ridiculous synergy with something else that's going to make it be so crazy it's going to need to be nerfed. And then finally, we have the Sorcerer with the Blue Rose, a Sorcerer Unique ring. Now this is a lucky hit. Damaging an enemy has up to a 30% chance of forming an exploding ice spike, dealing 0.25 to 0.35 cold damage. Triple this chance if the enemy is frozen. So a lucky hit up to 30% chance is kind of middle of the road lucky hit, but triple this up to a 90% chance if the target is frozen. So if you're using a build with a lot of freeze, this could be a pretty high chance to proc. Now I don't know about the proc itself. It spawns an ice spike that deals 0.2 to 0.3 cold damage, so I assume that's just 25 to 35% of the damage of the ice spike itself, I guess, depending on how this scales. Now one thing I have heard about this is that depending on how this works, this could be very good for staggering bosses, especially staggering uber bosses, and that's definitely one of the ways a lot of builds, especially sorcerer builds, dealt with uber Lilith. They would just be focused around staggering the boss, then bursting the boss down within that stagger. So depending on how good it is, it could potentially be really good for that. But I do have to say, this seems like one of the weaker new unique items for just general use, but if it ends up being ridiculously strong for boss killing and boss staggering, this would actually make this crazy strong in season 2, because we have 5 new endgame bosses that are how you target farm all uniques. But that's all of the new uniques coming with season 2, and keep in mind these will be added to the Eternal Realms when season 2 is launched. These aren't going to be something specific to season 2 like with all the other unique items we'll be getting in every season. And like I mentioned, I think some of these are some of the most unique and interesting uniques we've gotten in the game, so I very much like the direction they're taking, especially with something like the Dolom Stone for the Druid we went over. Just incredibly unique and cool effects on some of these unique items. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.